Okay, I have just a few minutes after 11, so why don't we get started. Welcome to everybody to another of our Saturday webinars made possible this year by the Ashbrook Center, which is an independent center at Ashland University offering a number of resources to help teachers teach young citizens what it means to be Americans. My name is Chris Burkett, Associate Professor of Political Science and History here at Ashland University. I'm also co-chair of our Master of Arts in American History and Government program, which I'm happy to say both of our panelists today are gracious enough to participate in and bring their wisdom and expertise to their classes. But for those of you joining us for the first time today, let me just mention again something about the point of these webinars. The point is to have some interesting conversations, hopefully, between some thoughtful scholars about what we're calling this year a series of American controversies and controversial questions. We encourage all of you to join us in that conversation today by submitting questions via the chat box. And you can submit them there and view the list of questions. I will try to get to as many of those as possible and submit them to our panelists. At the end of the webinar today, you will all be asked to fill out a survey form. Please do complete that form. Include your address so that we can send you a letter documenting your participation today. To help us begin to think about these questions, we are once again drawing heavily on the list of 50 core American documents that the Ashbrook Center has put out, and you can get copies of that online. You can get it in book form from paperback. There we go. Okay, so you can get the 50 core documents book in paperback form through Amazon. You can also get a free ebook version through iTunes. On that note, let me mention a new addition to the expanding list of great texts published by the Ashbrook Center. We now have available, I'm not sure if you can see it, a new edition of James Madison's Debates in the Federal Convention of 1787. This version is edited by Gordon Lloyd, who's done a lot of work for the Ashbrook Center on the websites available on teachingamericanhistory.org on the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and ratification. And it's a fantastic edition. I think it's the most useful edition out there because of the way it's put together. And Professor Lloyd has painstakingly gone through Madison's notes, his records of the debates, in their revised format and presented us with a version the way James Madison wanted them to be presented. So it's a great edition. That also is available as a paperback version through Amazon or as a free ebook through iTunes as well. Now, our question for today is there a constitutional right to nullification and secession? And again, we're drawing heavily on some documents from the 50 core documents, including the Websterhain debates, Calhoun's Fort Hill address, and Andrew Jackson's proclamation regarding nullification. We've also recommended a handful of supplemental readings from our extensive original document database at teachingamericanhistory.org, including 2 letters from James Madison, one to Nicholas Trist and another to Daniel Webster, Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural address, and his message to Congress in the special session of July 4th, 1861. Before we turn to the question, let me introduce our panelists today. Michael Schwartz is Assistant Professor of History at Ashland University and serves as Assistant Director of the Ashbrook Scholar Program for undergraduate students here. He's published numerous essays on founding era politics and foreign relations, including in the Journal of the Early Republic and the Journal of Southern History. He's also named Ashland University's Outstanding Male Faculty in 2011-2012. He received his PhD from the University of Kentucky, and he's taught several master's courses for us on the American Revolution, sectionalism and Civil War, colonial America, the Early Republic, and Age of Enterprise. Mac Owens is Senior Fellow of the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia and editor of Orbis, that organization's quarterly journal. He recently retired after 27 years of teaching at the United States Naval War College and continues to be a contributing editor to National Review Online, Wall Street Journal, and other publications. His own publications include a book called U.S. Civil-Military Bargain After 9/11, Renegotiating the Civil-Military Bargain, which was published in 2011. He's also a retired colonel from the Marine Corps and served in Vietnam, where he was wounded twice and awarded the Silver Star Medal. Mac received his PhD from the University of Dallas, and he also has taught several courses in master's programs on sectionalism and Civil War, Reconstruction, the American Way of War, and recently, Mac, I think a course on William Faulkner and Flannery O'Connor. Is that right? That was just
correct.
Yeah, good. Very interesting. Thanks to both of you for being with us this morning. Been looking forward to this conversation for quite a while. So before we turn to this question, let me just start by introducing it in a certain sense by pointing out that, as you know, this question of nullification and secession are typically associated with the larger concept of states' rights. And we hear a lot of emphasis placed these days on states' rights, typically by those who, generally frown upon what they consider to be overreach by the national government. But there are, of course, as you know, very healthy nullification and, in fact, secession movements. Well, how healthy is a question of debate, but there are some strong nullification and secession movements in several states in the country today. And I find it really amazing that after 200-some years, Americans are still arguing over these concepts of secession and nullification. So let me just start by throwing a broad question out. Feel free to start with this if you like, or take it in any direction you like. But let me first pose the question, why do both of you think that these questions, the question of states' rights or secession or nullification, call them whatever you want, why are Americans still debating these things today so strongly? I'll let either of you start.
Well, I'll give it a shot.
Please.
I mean, I think you said it just a second ago. It's the idea that there is always concern about the overreach of the federal government. And as long as you understand the federal government as being limited to the protection of natural rights, which I think was the original understanding of the Constitution, Declaration, and so forth, this is less of a problem. But if you look at the government as basically trying to increase its own power at the expense of the people and so forth, this idea of having some sort of a barrier between the people and the overreach of federal government raises these issues. What should it be? What level should it be? And naturally, the issue of the various states comes up, and that becomes sort of almost the idea of interposition. And you see a lot of that with regard to basically the healthcare issues, federal regulations, environmental regulations, and so forth, that a lot of people see as completely onerous, that they've abandoned the idea of protection of natural rights, and the idea now is to advance government power. And so I think that accounts for the popularity in many regions of sort of proto-secessionist movements, or some idea of the states interposing themselves between the federal government and the people.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think the recent healthcare debate is a good example. I think one of the reasons there remains a healthy debate over secession and states' rights and nullification is that the people as a whole, I don't think, have seen a very vibrant constitutional debate at the national level. I think they see different shades of the same basic phenomenon, which is a tendency and inclination to expand the powers of government, whether it's into the domestic sphere or into foreign policy areas. But I think at the same time, the people retain a healthy instinct for restraint upon government. And they don't really think they have an outlet for channeling that instinct at the national level, when all three branches of the federal government appear to have reached the same basic conclusion about the powers of the federal government. And so where else does one turn in the American tradition? We don't promote lawlessness, and we don't quite think we're at the point of revolution, mercifully. We turn to the states. I think it's a legitimate and healthy and historical conversation to have.
Yeah, that's very interesting. But is there I mean, what we've seen in the past is that the proponents of that view that both of you were actually just describing, this idea that there has to be a kind of healthy resistance to national overreach. Is there a line to be drawn in the application of those things? It seems to me that that's all the idea that the states have to have pushback somehow against these things. Where does the line draw? Where's the line drawn to the point? I mean, let me ask it another way. Does the idea that the states have the right to push back actually lead to the idea that a state can veto a federal act, or even, to the extent that they don't think that act is constitutionally warranted, can they actually secede from the Union? I mean, it seems to me that's the big question, right, that Americans are really struggling with. So you're both suggesting that it's not so much the idea that the states have the right to push back. That idea itself is not so controversial, but the more controversial question is, to what extent or how far can these things be taken?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, there's first of all the simple answer to your question: is there a constitutional right to nullification of secession? The answer is no. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't other forms of resistance. Now, the problem with Southern secession, during the Civil War was the fact that they tried to take this issue and turn it into a constitutional question, which it simply is not. As Lincoln says, look, you can amend the Constitution or you can revolutionize. And, Michael just mentioned it a minute ago that, that's one of the alternatives. As Lincoln said at one point during this whole debate leading up to the secession of the Southern states in 1860, even before he was inaugurated, that the South had been poisoned by this sort of idea that the state was somehow sacred in all of this. The fact is that we as colonists did not secede from the British Union and the British Empire in 1776. We revolutionized against it. The Southern states didn't want to take that step. They didn't want to call it revolution. They wanted to call it a legal step that they could take under the Constitution, which I think is simply wrong. But that's the line.
I agree with that, Mac, and I wonder about why that was necessary. Why couldn't it just have been the revolution of 1860? In fact, I think the Charleston Mercury in one of its editorials referred to it as that. The revolution of 1860 has been initiated, and yet all of the arguments fall back on the constitutional point. Even Jefferson Davis's farewell address to the Senate in early 1861, he says nullification wasn't constitutional, but secession actually is. So I don't know, what do you guys think about why Southerners insisted that this must be a constitutional measure?
Well, one answer, I think, is I call him the evil genius of American politics, is John Calhoun. Calhoun, during this period of time, was very effective in doing something. He essentially, especially in his disquisition on government, he establishes a new basis for a founding. He rejects Publius, he rejects the Federalist Papers, he rejects that whole argument, and sets up a completely new basis that leads to his idea somehow that the state is sacred. Now, the interesting thing about this is it's all built around the issue of slavery. And I think that's one of the reasons right there that, when we declared our independence, we recurred to natural rights. We said we're establishing a government to protect these natural rights. That's a revolution. The South really couldn't do that for the simple reason that one of the main reasons they were seceding, if not the main reason they were seceding, was to protect the institution of slavery. And it's very hard to recur to natural rights when you're simply trying to establish a government that, while limited, what Calhoun did very interestingly, he established a government that was limited to the national level. In other words, the states were somehow could in fact resist federal power, so it was limited. Federal government was limited. However, the states themselves were despotic because his ideas didn't apply at the state level. States which basically enforce slavery were in fact despotic. So the argument, he did not use the natural rights argument I think that the founders did. He was clever enough to establish a new basis for argument, which does two things at the same time: a limited government on the one hand, while defending slavery on the other. Now that's really quite a feat, if you ask me.
Yes, but Mac, if I can just jump in here for a second from Calhoun's point of view, what you're describing is, I mean, what you're assuming that the Constitution should in fact be interpreted in a certain way in light of the larger principles laid out in the Declaration of Independence. And as we know, John C. Calhoun rejected those principles, and he rejected those principles explicitly, right? You can look at his speech on the Oregon Bill, for example, and these things. But so what Calhoun, if I can just from Calhoun's point of view here for a second, assumes is that the Constitution must in a way be read without any coloring, if you will, from those larger ideas in the Declaration of Independence. So it seems like Calhoun then is moving toward on the one hand, I want to say a more strict, it's not quite more strict or literal interpretation of the Constitution, because we know that he's going to read things into the Constitution. But if you're going to read what the Constitution means, you have to read it free from any bias, if you will, or any taint from those ideas that are expressed in the Declaration of Independence. So once you do that, Calhoun then wants to interpret the Constitution, almost as its own standalone document, right? So let me just again play devil's advocate here for a second, and from Calhoun's perspective, I think he would argue that there is in fact a constitutional right to secede and nullify because of the nature of the compact. Okay, leave the Declaration of Independence out of it. Let's look at the origin of the Constitution as a compact, and he therefore, he does this pretty clearly in the Fort Hill Address. The Constitution is a compact between sovereign and independent states, right? And his evidence for that is, for example, maybe the language of the preamble, "We, the people of the United States of America." Even that language seems to suggest that the people of the states are separate from each other somehow. And he wants to think of the Constitution as a compact. How do you deal with that kind of argument? A compact between the states, I should say.
Well, go ahead, Mac.
No, go ahead. I've been yakking too much. You go ahead, Michael.
Oh, okay. Well, I think Calhoun's argument has to be taken seriously before you can refute it, and understand why exactly it is that he's arguing this. For instance, when he says the Constitution is a compact between and among the states, one of the reasons he has to make that argument is that Northerners have been arguing, for instance, basically since the Missouri Compromise, that Congress has a right to prohibit slavery in the territories, and they cite the Northwest Ordinance. And the Northwest Ordinance, of course, was drafted the same summer that the Constitution was ratified. And what's interesting to me about the Northwest, a lot of this, to my mind, actually revolves around the Northwest Ordinance. Because the history of the slavery provisions of the Northwest Ordinance, I think tells us something interesting. And I'm not, at this point in my thinking about it, I'm not entirely sure, frankly, what I think about it, but I think it's important. For instance, you guys know the language of the Northwest Ordinance, which says there shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in those territories north and west of the Ohio River, basically what became the present-day states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, etc. That language was adopted almost verbatim from Thomas Jefferson's report on government for the Western Territory, which was written in 1784. Back then, in 1784, it was not adopted. The language, it failed by one vote. In fact, Jefferson was the only Southern member to vote for that ban on slavery. 3 years later, the language was resuscitated, and it was approved as part of the Northwest Ordinance, which is why Ohio and all those states came in as free states. But it came in with a corresponding fugitive slave provision. There shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, provided that those states agree to return fugitives who escape across the river. And then we get to the Constitution, and Chris, and you probably know a little bit more about how the Fugitive Slave Clause got into the Constitution. But what's interesting to me is that the Fugitive Slave Clause from the Northwest Ordinance makes its way into the Constitution, and yet the prohibition on slavery, or an express power authorizing Congress to ban slavery in the territories, does not show up there. So Calhoun goes back to the Northwest Ordinance and he says, look, the only reason Congress could ban slavery in the first place was because that Northwest Ordinance was part of a compact among the states. It wasn't an act of a national government per se. The Confederation was absolutely a compact. So I think you have to start there and understand a couple of things. One is that Calhoun's argument, to my mind at least, goes back to that Northwest Ordinance, and it's a serious argument. So we have to wrestle with that. And secondly, that the whole thing, as Mac pointed out just a moment ago, the whole thing originates in the question of slavery. And you can put different glosses on it, and we get to things like the tariff. You know, maybe Southerners actually have an argument on the tariff, not on nullification necessarily, but on the injustice of the tariff. That might be a different question. But the compact question, I think, to me, is worth taking seriously.
Yeah, because it seems as though that, you know, there's something about the very nature of the Union. I mean, you think about the way this Union came together, right? There's 13 separate colonies until, you know, you declare your independence, at which point you either, you know, go from being 13 separate states to somehow being part of a union, or, as Lincoln argues, that there's never that in-between moment. You go from being separate colonies, loosely united under allegiance to the crown, you slip from that almost seamlessly into states being part of a union. But still, the fact that you have, you know, states, and even after the Articles, and even after the Constitution is ratified, you have what we call this idea of federalism, where there are layers of government, states and national government. It's a weird thing. It's just as weird in itself, because it's a union of different sovereignties in a kind of way. And it seems to me that just the nature of that union actually lends itself to this kind of debate. It actually lends itself to the question of, again, what has come to be known as states' rights. And so I think that does give Calhoun a kind of leg to stand on when he looks back and he says, how was the Constitution actually created? How was it ratified? It was ratified by an agreement between the states. So, you know, I don't know. I mean, this is a tough thing. It's just my only point on all of that is it seems like the very nature of this union, it opens itself up to these kinds of arguments.
Right. But I'm sorry. Go ahead, Mac.
I think you get that. I mean, that was why they had the Constitutional Convention in the first place, because the Articles of Confederation were exactly as you described it. The states basically were sovereign. Nothing could get done by anybody. There was no real power to accomplish things. So you did have a state sovereignty to an extent that Calhoun is probably comfortable with. Once you move to the Constitution, though, the Constitutional Convention, the relationship among the states, I think, changes. Madison talks about the fact that it's both national and federal. It's national in its sphere, and it's federal in its sphere. The states are sovereign in their sphere. Of course, the issue is, in practice, how do you draw the line? And that's been the question ever since. For a long time, it had to do with the taxing power. It had to do with tariffs and so forth. And it also gets around to the issue of slavery. Now, remember, I mean, it was fully understood by everybody that the federal government had no power over the institution of slavery where it existed. That was a state's determination. However, and again, we go back to Michael's point here. When you get to the Northwest Ordinance and the Missouri Compromise, the belief on the part of Lincoln and others was that Congress did have the authority to prohibit slavery into those territories. So, you know, Lincoln never, and for that matter, none of the Republicans or Whigs leading up to the Civil War believed that you could interfere directly with slavery in those states. The question, though, becomes now, at the national level, what can the federal government do with the territories, which are presumably the property of all of the of all Americans? And that's again, one of the issues is, where do you draw this line between federal power or national power and state power?
That's a good point.
Yeah, I agree, and I don't think it necessarily follows from Calhoun's compact argument. I mean, even if you accept that relations between the national government and state governments didn't change as much as he thought, as we might think they did from 1786 to 1787, 88, it doesn't necessarily follow that a state has a constitutional right, because of course that right is rooted in the document itself and not in Calhoun's interpretation of the Confederation era. It doesn't necessarily follow that you have a right of nullification or secession. That these things that has to come. I think those rights would have to come from somewhere else, and not necessarily from the document itself. And again, I wonder why they were never actually willing to concede such a thing.
Yeah, but where else would they come from, Mike, if they don't come from the document? So you're suggesting it comes from, again, some understanding of a pre-Constitution view of the nature of the Union somehow, or the pre-Constitution understanding of what sovereignty of a state means and what the rights of states are?
Well, I don't know if it's a pre-Constitution view or if it's just an understanding that the ultimate responsibility for protecting the rights and liberties of the people rests with the people themselves, and that's why they've taken their sovereignty and they've divided powers at multiple levels through multiple layers of government, and that when, for instance, when all three branches of the federal government conspire to trample the liberties of the people, to ignore the First Amendment as they did in 1798 with the Alien and Sedition Acts, what recourse is left? But it's not necessarily a power that's found in the Constitution itself. Right. Because what's happened is that the Constitution has been trampled. The Constitution has been ignored, and a power that is acknowledged or a party that's acknowledged in the Constitution without actually having a final say on what the Constitution means, then has to step up and assert its objection. So that, for instance, I mean, this is why the Supreme Court can't be the final arbiter of all constitutional questions, and Lincoln admits as much in one of those paragraphs in his inaugural, which I think is a fantastic and frankly a Jeffersonian, not a John Marshall kind of argument. It rests with the people. Now, what comes down to then is, you guys asked the question, where do you draw the line? And the line has to come in a considered, mature reflection of the issues at hand, the severity of them, and whether or not some remedy short of revolution or even secession might be possible. And I think, my judgment here, and this is the last thing I'll say, and then I'll turn it back over. A lot of this, of course, springs from the early 1830s controversy over the tariff. To my mind, a tariff, however objectionable it might be in practice, it is not palpably a violation of the Constitution. In fact, I would argue it's not a violation of the Constitution to impose those tariffs.
But Mike Calhoun did argue that it was a violation because of the purpose for which the tariff was levied, right?
That's right. That's right. He said the purpose for which it was levied was the protection of northern manufacturers. And the truth is, there's nothing in the Article 1, Section 8 about regulating commerce which says that protection, basically 18th century mercantilism, is unconstitutional. In fact, Madison would have argued that, and did argue many times, that was the purpose of that Commerce Clause. The purpose of the Commerce Clause was not so that the architects of the New Deal could tell us what to grow and what not to grow. The purpose was to regulate international commerce, right, for national benefit. So you can obliterate the palpable objection part of that, or palpably unconstitutional part, right off the bat. So I think it comes down to the ability of the people acting in whatever capacity to determine the severity of the issue and whether or not it violates the Constitution or threatens their rights and liberties.
Very interesting.
Let me kind of step back too, because we went quickly over this, and I think we get to the issue of remedies. Lincoln says, look, again, you can amend the Constitution or you can revolutionize against it. There's also something else we call elections. Okay, it's very clear that there was overreach in 1798, 1799, 99 with the Alien and Sedition Acts. Okay, and there you have the response from both Jefferson and Madison. I'm sure we'll get to those in a minute. But the real response was the election of 1800, which basically threw the Federalists out and brought the Jeffersonians in. And we forget sometimes that that is the remedy. That's the people's remedy to bad government. I mean, you don't need to resort to secession. That's the big difference between the election of 1800 and the election of 1860, was that in 1860 you had an election that went one way, and the minority didn't like the outcome, and so therefore they decided they'd take their ball and go home. And I think that those are two of the most consequential elections in American history, 1800 and 1860. One pointing the correct way to go, that is to the people, if they feel they've been oppressed, will change the government, to the other one where people win an election and the losers decide basically that they're not going to abide by the outcome. But we always have to remember that one of the people's remedies to bad government is elections. And you get some sense of that here just very recently. I mean, you know, we can certainly overanalyze this and we can pay too much attention to it, but I think the general sense is that people were concerned about Washington's overreach with some of these things the federal government were doing, and they concluded that Republicans were a better choice to try to limit some of those sorts of things. I may be wrong, and the Republicans can always manage to screw themselves up as well, but it's a we have to remember this issue of elections and the will of the people.
The point that point that you raise about that, Mac, seems to me why Lincoln claims that the principle of anarchy of secession is one of anarchy. The essence of, because if you don't agree to abide by the outcome of an election, and instead you say, well, I don't like the outcome of this, then you have other means or recourses to take, you know, then there really is no standard by which a people can remain together and agree on anything, essentially, right? So the principle of secession is one of anarchy. But we had, I mean, both of you brought up some really great points, and we've had some really great questions submitted. And earlier, one of you touched on this idea of the grounds for protest, if you will, in the states. And somebody asked a question asking for, I think, clarification between, you know, the idea of exercising what we might call legitimate revolution and what the grounds for that might be versus the idea of secession, right? So what's the difference between secession and the idea of exercising revolution on principle?
Well, revolution it's an act. It's an act that basically requires that you bear some responsibility and the consequences of your action. When the United States revolutionized against Great Britain, the outcome of that, if we had lost, would be lots of public executions and the like. Now the South wanted to basically get away from that. They wanted to make this argument, and again, we cannot underestimate the influence of John Calhoun. As Michael said, we tend to today to dismiss him as a racist defender of slavery and so forth. But the fact is, he's one of the great public intellectuals of the 19th century, for better or for worse. And I think, of course, for worse. But it's an argument that he made that has to be refuted. You just can't blow it off and say, well, you know, he's a racist, and therefore we don't have to pay any attention to him. The fact is, he came up with a different way of looking at things. What he tried to do was to try to take this idea that, again, making the state sort of the dominant political institution in the United States, and say that when the states ratified the Constitution, they essentially did so conditionally. Now, you mentioned Gordon Lloyd a few minutes ago, and Gordon Lloyd has forgotten more about the various founding era than most people know. And I saw him one time. He was asked about that, and he said the only instance that he could recall of somebody suggesting what we would, the idea that the states could reserve to themselves the right to secede when they ratified the Constitution was raised by Melancthon Smith of New York, who had suggested it to Madison, and Madison rejected because he said, you either ratify it or you don't.
Yeah.
So Madison himself rejected the idea of conditional ratification. Now, when you get defenders of Southern secession, they say, well, all the states reserved to themselves that right. But if you actually look at what those states said, they were, they were basically simply voicing the thing that all of us recognize they had, including Lincoln, that they always had the right of revolution. The right of revolution is, first of all, you put yourself in a state of nature with the other organization. The idea of, this idea of nullification is, well, we're just going to slide out of the union and you can't stop us because we conditionally ratified. Well, if you look at, again, the debates, both the federal convention and the state conventions, ratification conventions, you don't see that. It's about, they're ratifying. They know all the arguments why they ought to, all the arguments why they ought not to. But essentially all the states eventually ratify with no conditions attached, except this one, which is always there, always acknowledged, and that is the right of revolution, which requires that you use force to separate yourself from the larger political union, especially if you accept the idea of the union as understood by the Constitution as opposed to the Articles of Confederation.
Right, that's great. Thanks, Mike. But again, Calhoun argued that there were conditions that had to be met in order for a state to remain in the union, right? And Calhoun argued that the states agreed to join this union on the assumption that again, as we said earlier, the interests of the states would be protected. So when Calhoun sees the interest of a state as being violated, he argues that the states did come in conditionally, right? And so now when a national government is acting contrary to the interests of the states, he argues that that's acting contrary to the purposes for which the union was formed in the first place. And so it's not, you're right, Mac, it's not an act of revolution per se, as you described it, and as Lincoln and probably the founders as well understood it. But it is, I think Calhoun would argue that secession is a legitimate constitutional exercise, not in light of anything written in the Constitution. We've had some other good questions raised about how can you draw this doctrine of secession out of the Constitution when it's not mentioned explicitly. Again, Calhoun says it must be implicit because it's just part of the reason for which the states came together through this compact. When the terms of a contract are violated, the contract is null and void, is it not? So whether you call it revolution or secession or whatever, Calhoun I don't think would care.
Well, if secession is constitutional, then once South Carolina leaves the Union, once it secedes, every other state retains the right of secession. Every other state may do what South Carolina did, in which case, South Carolina leaving the Union doesn't solve the problem. There's still the problem of enforcing laws passed by deliberative representative institutions that contain the representatives of the states that have now chosen to leave. In which case, popular self-government, or Republican self-government, is actually impossible. It's one of the reasons, well, I shouldn't say it's one of the reasons, because we can look at 1776 in light of 1832 and confuse some things, I think. But to say that the American colonists seceded from the British Empire would be technically incorrect in the way that we understand it, because, of course, the American colonists did not enjoy anything like self-government within the British Empire, as defined by Parliament. They never justified, the American colonists never said, we're leaving the empire because the British Constitution authorizes us to do so. They said, we're leaving the empire because we retain the right of revolution. When do we exercise the right of revolution? When confronted by a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object. If you can argue that in 1832, the federal government had been pursuing invariably the same object evincing a design to reduce South Carolina under absolute despotism through whatever, protective tariffs or internal improvements. That if you want to argue that, then be my guest. I don't think most reasonable people would conclude that South Carolina faced a long train of abuses and usurpations, either then or in 1860. So if you're going to remove the long train of abuses and usurpations requirement, well, then you have to ground it. You have to ground this on something other than the right of revolution. You have to ground it in the Constitution, where, of course, it doesn't technically exist. So I think it's. Obviously, it's pretty clear that South Carolina's actions and John C. Calhoun's theory both lay outside of the American tradition as established by the Declaration of Independence.
Yes, that's really interesting. We've got a number of really good questions, so I'm going to shift gears a little bit and throw one out, although it's related to clearly related to the train of thought here recently. Somebody mentioned the Hartford Convention. The delegates at the Hartford Convention calling for secession, did they make the same kind of constitutional argument that Calhoun made, Mike or Max? Do either of you know this?
That's a good question. I'm not familiar with the actual debates at the Hartford Convention. In fact, I don't know where they are, where you can find them published. It would have been a great coincidence had they cited the 1798 Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, because of course the reason that those New England Federalists came together at Hartford was to consider seceding from a union dominated by Virginia presidents. They didn't like the War of 1812. And they considered secession in large part because their interests were no longer protected within the Union. Same argument that you get in some respects from South Carolina. But I am not aware of any place in which New England Federalists, treacherous though they might have been, treasonous though they might have been in 1814, and I would argue before as well, there's no indication that anywhere they ever cited a constitutional right to either nullification or to secession. They did everything they could to frustrate the Madison administration's prosecution of the war. They flashed signals, the blue light Federalists flashing signals from on shore to alert the British vessels, to alert the blockade that American blockade runners were on the way. And this isn't the vast majority of people in Connecticut, but the Connecticut Federalists who came together there, they were, by that point, they had reduced themselves to an illegitimate British faction within America. But even they, who I would argue, now this, by the way, these aren't the Federalists of Alexander Hamilton. I mean, they're the same party, but they had gone so far off the rails by 1814 that I would argue that they fall outside of the American tradition. And yet, I still don't think they made the same kinds of arguments that South Carolina was making.
That's interesting. So it's really Calhoun and others, Payne and others. We've got the Websterhain debates. The idea that this right is somehow embedded in the Constitution is really a new one that seems to arise largely in the late 1820s.
Yeah.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Yeah, and again, I'll go back. There's only a limit of what you can have folks read, but I would recommend to everybody, if you want to read the logical layout of an alternative founding of America that rejects Publius and the Declaration of Independence, read Calhoun's Disposition on Government. He lays it out very logically from the beginning. His argument that man is a social animal. He delivers all these ideas. He uses this to move to the concept of governments, constitutions, and then what he calls the concurrent majority, which is basically a minority veto. That's what you really end up with.
Yeah.
And his argument is that he says, okay, what has happened here in the United States is you've got the northern faction dominates the southern faction, and therefore they can basically dominate them in all cases politically. And so what you need is this idea of a minority veto. And of course, if you want to see nothing getting done, that's what you want, because that's what you're going to get with this whole idea. But he goes farther than that. He raises this issue, which is, if you were saying that basically concurrent majority ought to work at the national level, why doesn't it work at the state level? In other words, why can't a minority within a state, say South Carolina, why can't they use the same sort of argument? And of course, now he has to address the issue of slavery. And what he says is, okay, there are no such things as natural rights. In other words, the natural right to freedom is bogus, and he says that essentially, that erroneous concept by Mr. Jefferson, the whole idea of equality of man and so forth. He says liberty is something that's earned, and only people who have historically achieved liberty deserve it. And since black African slaves haven't earned it, they don't deserve it. There's no argument on behalf of natural rights in it. I mean, it's very clever, because as I say, on the one hand, what he does is he justifies state sovereignty, limit federal government, while at the same time defending the institution of slavery. And he does that by establishing a constitution without the Declaration of Independence. You remember Lincoln's famous characterization of the relationship between the Declaration and the Constitution. He uses one of the proverbs to say a word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in a frame of silver. He says, the frame is for the picture of gold, not the reverse. The gold, the apple of gold, is the Declaration. The frame of silver is the Constitution. Well, Calhoun rejects the Declaration, and he's able to do this. And I think it's this argument. I mean, this occurs, of course, after Hartford. This argument is now gaining traction, especially in the South, as a way of, basically defending the issue of, first of all, interposition, nullification, and then therefore the most extreme form, the secession, and saying that this isn't associated with revolution anyway. This is a constitutional right, which again I think is arguably wrong.
Interesting. Can you just very quickly, because Mac, you've used the term interposition twice. Is there a difference between interposition and nullification?
I think they're just kind of the same thing. Interposition basically is the broader context of, can the state government step in to interpose itself between a law passed by the federal government and the people upon whom the law would be executed. Nullification is more specific. It basically says we will not enforce that law within the states.
Yeah, because I always thought of nullification as one means
of interposition
of a state to interpose itself, right, between a federal act and its.
So interposition is more broad. Nullification is more specific.
Right, and I think if interposition is, that's exactly right. I think interposition is actually more nuanced. It's more Madisonian. Madison actually uses that word. Jefferson used the word nullify in his draft of the 1798 Kentucky resolutions, but Madison, of course, defended him from that point forward, saying that his words have been twisted to a different purpose. I think Madison's vision of interposition is basically a state legislature interposes itself between the national government and the people, but it does not render those federal laws inoperative. It appeals to its sister states, to the other state legislatures. And so, for instance, if you could get a majority or maybe 9 of the 13 to go along with you, then we might actually be able to do something about that federal law. But it's a much more careful way of approaching state involvement or state intervention in this question. Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
You mentioned Madison because as you know, in his report on the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, he really clarifies that difference between nullification and interposition. But since you mentioned it, I want to ask a question about Madison and Jefferson's views on these things. And by the way, I just want to tell a quick story. I had in one of my undergraduate courses where we were talking about these things several years ago. After class, I had a student come up to me who said, I'm reading these things. I'm inclined to agree with Calhoun because I'm a neo-Confederate. And I said, well, tell me why you're a neo-Confederate. Why? And he said, well, and he basically made the kinds of arguments that we started with, right? He didn't like the extent to which the national government had grown, and it was taking away the freedom and liberty that the people of the various states had to determine their own laws and these kinds of things. And I made the counter argument, well, it sounds like you were more of what you might call a James Madison Federalist, right? The idea that there are distinct separations of powers between the national and the state governments, and it sounds like you're really in support of the the 9th and 10th Amendments and these kinds of things. And he said, well, no, I'm not really. I mean, I guess in a sense, but his response was, James Madison and Thomas Jefferson were in favor of secession and nullification. And so what he was implying was that Jefferson and Madison, had they been around later, much later, they would have been in fact Confederates themselves. Any truth to this argument or not?
Wow.
Respond to something like that.
Yeah, unfortunately that has persisted. We're fortunate enough that Madison was alive during the Nullification Crisis,
right,
to speak on his own behalf. And to suggest that there's absolutely no way of connecting either his Virginia resolution or even Jefferson's Kentucky resolution to what was happening in 1832. I mean, in 1832, John C. Calhoun elevated this to a constitutional doctrine, to a doctrine to be applied in all circumstances. In which, for instance, a federal law might operate unequally, or where one thinks one can divine the motives of those who have passed the law. Well, the law itself, it might be constitutional, but they're going to put it towards unconstitutional ends. And of course, Jackson's proclamation on nullification just destroys that reasoning entirely. Jefferson, about 6 weeks before the Sedition Act was passed in 1798, Jefferson wrote a letter in response to one he'd received from John Taylor. It was June 4th, 1798. It's famous as the Reign of Witches letter. I'm sure you guys have read this. Jefferson says he's getting reports from Virginia that Federalist governance and Federalist laws are so onerous and so palpably in violation of the Constitution, which some of them were not, but that was the argument coming from Virginia, that we don't think any longer we can retain our place in the Union, and that it wasn't unusual to hear men talk about a separate confederacy between, for instance, Virginia and North Carolina. And Jefferson's response was as clear as day. He said there has never been an association of men who will not quarrel. And we must hang together with our New England associates. If we separated, we would separate. Immediately there'd become a Virginia party and a North Carolina party, and then of course it's the Lincoln argument that it wouldn't stop from there. Jefferson counseled patience. He said patience, and the reign of witches will pass over, their spells dissolve, and the people recovering their true sight will restore their government to its true principles. And he said the same thing in the 1820s to Justice William Johnson, to William Branch Giles, which is, of course, of more recent vintage for the Nullification Crisis. He said we can never submit to a consolidated government of unlimited powers. At that point, we have no choice but to revolutionize. But up until that point, we must have patience. We must trust that the people will set things to right. I think it's actually an insult to Jefferson's memory and to his long service in the name of the Union and for the sake of republicanism and lowercase f federalism to suggest that he would have busted up the Union in 18, that he would have gone with the Confederate side.
In fact, it seems to me that in his I'm sorry, Mike, to interrupt, but
go right ahead.
There were more writings from Jefferson lamenting what he sees as this growing split in the Union, right? I'm thinking just immediately of his letter to John Holmes, where he says, the actions of the founders are about to be thrown away by the unwise passions of their sons, who are going to allow this Union to dissolve and split over the moral principle. So
I think that's exactly right, Chris. And if I could point all of the teachers to a particular place in the documents, the first paragraph of the Fort Hill Address, John C. Calhoun gives us his history of the relevant matters here. And the last few lines, the great struggle that preceded the political revolution of 1801, which brought Mr. Jefferson into power, turned essentially on it, meaning the question of states' rights, basically.
Right.
And that's I bracketed this, and for my own purposes, just wrote down, this is wrong. This is not the history of the 1790s. It's Calhoun reading back into the 1790s, a history of national-minded Federalists on one hand, and Republicans devoted to states' rights and nullification and secession if necessary on the other hand. It's simply not true. I mean, any party that would attract James Madison, let alone that James Madison would lead, could not be the party of states' rights and secession.
That's a great line to point to, Mike, and it reminds me also in the Websterhain debates. Hain makes a similar argument where he traces the development of the political parties, right? The parties that we had now in 1832 or in 1830s when he's making this argument are, you can trace them back to divisions over this question, over the nature of the Union. One party placed, they basically wanted consolidation, right? And the other party believed in defending the rights of states. So yeah, there's this growth. So you're suggesting this is a new revisionist, if you will, history of the founding and the development of the parties that Jefferson stood for and others. So.
Oh, I think it's absolutely the case. I think it's an invented history, much like Roger B. Taney's opinion in Dred Scott is an invented history. I mean, much as we might despise him or his words, Alexander Stephens in the Cornerstone speech, when he said, for instance, Jefferson and the people of the Revolutionary era, when they wrote "all men are created equal," they meant what they wrote. They were simply wrong. Now, we don't like those words, but that's an accurate representation of the history of the 18th century and early 19th century. But what Taney does in Dred Scott and what Calhoun has done here is basically to invent a history to suit their purposes. And what are their purposes? Well, to clothe this, what Jackson calls this strange doctrine of nullification, in the authority of the founding generation. And it simply can't be done. It can't be done because the party division of the 1790s was not a division between nationalists and advocates of states' rights. It had to do with all sorts of complicated things like our relations to Britain and France and Hamilton's fiscal plan. Do we want it? Do we not? There are all sorts of ways we can go at that, but that's not the place to begin. The place to begin is once the Federalists disappear from the scene after 1815, and we have basically just Democratic Republican government. At what point do we split into national Republicans and Democratic Republicans, eventually Democrats? And why do we do that? That has much more to do with the question of national power versus state authority. And it's new. That's the part of it they don't want to get into, is that it's new.
Yeah, and do you think the split of the Democratic, and Max, feel free to jump in at any point, but the split of the Democratic Party into national, or the Republican Party into national and Democratic Republicans, does that contribute somehow then to the rise of the debates between Webster and Hain? The fact that, does it suggest to one side or the other that there are, to say to the national Republicans, there are these crazy guys over here who are all states' rights, and on the other flip side, it may appear to the, to the mind of somebody who aligns with the Democratic Republicans, that there seems to be this growing faction, if you will, of Republicans who are nationalists to the extent that they want to, again, consolidate and do away with the rights of the states that we feel that they ought to retain. Is the split in the parties, the split in that party itself, does that contribute to the growing question, or is the question itself developing, and does that contribute to the split in that party?
I think it's the first, the way you described it. I think that what we have after 1815, we've seen some of these issues before. That the National Bank was rechartered in 1816. That obviously had been a thorny issue 25 years earlier. The question of internal improvements, Jefferson's own Secretary of the Treasury, Albert Gallatin, drafted a report on internal improvements. It's not as if these specific issues hadn't come up in the past. But John Marshall's opinion in McCulloch v. Maryland, the kind of unabashed, unapologetic nationalism that invokes, that was threatening. But I think that when you combine all of these things with the ferment that occurred during the Missouri crisis, when you combine all of this with slavery agitation, that is what in many ways gave rise to the ultimate split between Whigs and Democrats. It's not that you didn't have Southern Whigs who were pro-slavery or Northern Democrats who were anti-slavery, but this business about national versus state power and the extent to which that defines divisions between the parties, Whigs versus Democrats. I think in many respects that's a product of the post-Federalist versus Republican era. It's a product of these new issues, or these old issues, now being blended with the controversy over slavery.
It just seems like there comes a point when on the side of those who end up supporting the idea of states' rights, they start to see all these little things start piling up, so that by the time, the thing that actually kicks off the Websterhain debate is really, I don't know how interesting a question it is. I mean, should the national government be able to derive a fund of revenue independent of, relying on the states? That was a huge question in the minds of those who see this thing developing, and I think it seems like it becomes almost conspiratorial. I'm not sure if that's the right way to describe it. But.
Absolutely. One of the things that, this is we forget now, we think we live in turbulent times. This is a very turbulent time, and a number of things that are happening. We've already mentioned a few. You've got the emergence of the second party system, basically, as we said. And by the way, I mean, the national Republicans who are Democrats who eventually become the Whigs basically now begin to turn back towards the Hamiltonian system. Clay's American system is essentially the Federalist system, that federal revenues can be used for internal improvements and so forth, and this is going on. You have the sort of reaction to the overreach. We heard that word before, of Andrew Jackson. I mean, the word Whig was consciously chosen by the opponents of Andrew Jackson, who they called him King Andrew I. The fact was the Whigs had been the country parliament party, the parliamentarian party in Great Britain. And then, of course, the slavery issue, which, you throw this into this whole witches brew. And now, what's said may at least have seemed simple when you're reading the Federalists, when you read Madison saying, well, in this sphere, the national government will be dominant, in this sphere, the state governments will be dominant. Now that line it's hard to discern in many cases. And so I think this is really much of what's going on. And of course, as this becomes more and more dominated by the slavery issue, it moves from being a debate over economics, where again you have members of both parties in the North and the South, to being one of sectionalism. And that again is what, I mean, very interesting about Calhoun. Calhoun was originally a nationalist. He was a supporter of tariffs. I mean, he was a war hawk. Right. He supported tariffs after the War of 1812 because we found that we actually needed revenue to fight wars and things like that. It's as the personal issues come up that he begins to shift now to this advocate of states' rights. I mean, he's writing. If we criticize, Thomas Jefferson for, feeding information to the opposition press when he was the Secretary of State, well, here's John C. Calhoun, the Vice President, and he's writing these, basically documents opposed to the policy of the President for whom he's whom he's serving as Vice President. So a lot of this is personal as well. Yeah. But I think what really happens here is that the issue of the state emerges the way it does out of this witch's brew, mainly because of the intellectual focus of John C. Calhoun, because he takes bits and pieces of this, pulls it out, and turns it into a principle, and he comes up with a new constitution. I mean, he calls it the same Constitution. I mean, he refers to the U.S. Constitution. The fact is, again, if you go back and you read the way he logically lays it out, he's established a new basis for constitutional government. And I think that's the big difference right there. If you don't understand Calhoun, I don't think you can understand much of what's going on today.
That's really interesting, Mac. Thanks. Can I ask a follow-up then to your arguments about Calhoun? What would you, because you laid out the sort of growing the causes of this tension, this sectionalism and the sort of conspiratorial distrust of the other side and so on and so forth that's developing. But what would you say to Calhoun's argument that because he does argue that only by adopting his interpretation of the Constitution with the concurrent majority and all of these things, only by adopting that understanding of the Constitution can the Union be saved? Is he right about that?
I don't think he is. I mean, you can. It's always what do you want to throw away? Okay, if you want to throw away sort of the moral foundations of the United States, then yeah, accept his argument. And that's exactly what he's doing here. I mean, the fact is that, look, one of the questions is there are secessionist movements all through the world. But if you look at a lot of these are based on ethnicities and so forth. The United States is a different kind of a nation. I mean, we're not a nation based on blood or language primarily. We're a nation that's based on a principle. And that principle is in the Declaration. And again, with the Constitution forming the what do you call it, the frame to the apples, the frame to the picture. So Calhoun, though, of course, is quite willing to throw that apple away, to throw the Declaration away, because he wants to defend the institution of slavery. Now, I think you can argue that first of all, if you want to plan for deadlock, it's concurrent majority, because nothing will ever get done. So you're not going to improve the efficiency of government. And I don't think you're going to save the republic or union that way either. But even if you stipulate that might be an outcome, you do it at the cost of throwing away the moral basis for American republicanism.
That's fascinating, Mac. I actually never thought of it that way. So if you really don't care about somehow the moral basis as it's expressed in the Declaration of Independence, then we could actually have gone down the road that Calhoun was arguing, which frames up again, I think, really the way you put that, Mac, again brings us back to why Lincoln thought it was so essential to preserve the Union.
Yeah. Look, I mean, we have not always lived up to our principles, right? And the compromises over slavery are an example of that. But I always caution my students to say, look, you cannot confuse the compromises we made over slavery in the Constitution to the principles in the Constitution. The compromises we made were to get the document ratified, and it was based on the sort of 18th century Enlightenment gentlemen, as they were, who believed that slavery was on the road to extinction. They didn't count on some Yankee named Eli Whitney inventing the cotton gin, which changed everything. But the fact is that if you don't have this moral basis, for the Union, then we're no better than any other form of government that's gone before. And that's always been that's the basis of exceptionalism, American exceptionalism. It's not that we're going to go conquer the world. It's that the basis of American republicanism is a little different than that of other empires and states that have gone before. And that's worth defending. And by the way, I mean, in Lincoln's Peoria speech, you remember what ought to be the end of it. He talks about, our Republican robe is soiled. Let us wash it with the blood of the founders and not only save the Union, but make it worth the saving. I think that's probably one of the most important passages in American political rhetoric. And I think that, that gets to the basis of why there's certain practical things you can do that might make efficiency of government, improve the efficiency of government, but do it at the cost of the ends of government.
That's fascinating. That's really fascinating.
Chris, can I add very briefly to all of that, because I think that's exactly right. The Calhoun is arguing that the only way we can save the Union is to adopt his constitutional interpretation and practice, nullification, concurrent majority, all of that. The only reason that would ever be true is that South Carolina and other states would threaten disunion repeatedly unless we adopt this, unless we permit them operating under that theory of concurrent majority to protect their special interests. And I hate to use that phrase because I sound like Theodore Roosevelt, but to protect their interests within the Union because the Union doesn't protect those interests. And of course, Webster's response to that is what benefits Ohio also benefits Carolina, that I don't see myself as protecting the interests of Ohio whenever we do things like that, whenever we dig a canal, for instance, that I see myself as advancing the interests of Americans. Which brings me to the ultimate point, at least for me, which is that this union is held together by sentiment. It's held together by public opinion. It's held together because we all believe that we belong to some larger political community called Americans, and that political community stands for something above the simple interest and the simple clashing of interests and the balancing of those interests. That there actually is something to this United States of America. In that sense, I actually think Calhoun also sits outside the American tradition. He frankly fits more with Hamilton and the argument that man can only be governed by appealing to his interests and not to his sentiments about union. So I think Calhoun is only in that respect resuscitating an older Federalist argument, but it's only going to hold the Union together if different parts of the Union are constantly threatening secession and frightening the concurrent parts of the sister parts of the Union into caving in.
It's like claiming you have the nuclear option, but saying we hope we never have to use it or we'll never use it. But
yes.
Okay.
Precisely. But in the end, it's a union of sentiment.
Yeah, but see, again, this points me back, and our time is coming to a close, so I don't want to talk too much, but it points me back again, Mike, to that problem, another problem that seems inherent in the nature of the Union from the beginning, because you go back to the founding, as you know, even at the Constitutional Convention, you had some delegates who were willing to say, I'm an American first and a Virginian second or something like that, but it seems like you have others who were just never really able to, flip the order of how they think about their native country, if you will, to use some of their language, right? So there are some Americans who say I'm an American first and a South Carolinian second, and there are some, it seems like, who say I'm a South Carolinian who happens to be, part of a union with other states, and so in that sense, it seems like that Calhoun view. I don't know if I don't think that's invented. It seems like that's maybe a resuscitation of that problem, or just a continuation of that problem as well. My only point in that was, again, it seems like these kinds of arguments, to a certain extent, are inevitable given the way this union comes together, and that achieving that union of sentiment that you're both alluding to here is really, really hard and difficult. And I think that the framers and founders understood this very well. Probably nobody better than Madison, or maybe even George Washington, who did a lot to try to overcome these state and regional differences. But anyway, I'm talking too much. We only have a minute or two left here, so this has been really great. One other question that came in, I thought maybe we'd end by saying something on this. A couple of people have mentioned the secessionist movements going on in the United States today, and most of them have to do with counties breaking off. Parts of a state want to break off, or certain counties want to break off, in Colorado or California, which is different than a state as a whole breaking off from the Union. But I wonder, to what extent do these same arguments apply? And just let me ask the question this way, maybe. What would either Lincoln or Calhoun or both think about the legitimacy of states breaking off from, portions of states breaking off from the rest of the state? Would they say that it's okay or not?
I would say that, first of all, Lincoln would say, I tell you so. Once you accept the principle of secession, then where does it stop?
Okay.
Basically, and I think Calhoun would say no, because just as we say, for some reason, while the theory of the concurrent majority works at the national level, for Calhoun, it did not work at the state level, so the state was dominant. So they say almost tyrannical. If you, again, especially put it in terms of slavery, The state of South Carolina during this period of time was a free member of the American Republic, but it did not accord its slaves the same rights that white South Carolinians asked for themselves. So I think those would be the two responses.
But yeah, I would say, I'm sorry, Chris, I would say given the nature of our union, counties can't break off from an individual state without also breaking off from the United States. We don't have to speculate. We know what happened. West Virginia broke off from Virginia in 1861, and Lincoln welcomed those unionists back into the Union, despite the fact the Constitution says you can't create a new state out of an existing state without the existing state's approval. But those counties, in breaking off from Virginia, were remaining loyal to the Union. They wanted to live under the Constitution, and so Lincoln accepted them into the political community. I think Calhoun would be hard-pressed to argue that there was no right of those counties to break off from states based on his theory. But with Lincoln, you can take it to above one level to the U.S. Constitution.
And Lincoln also believed, though, that the people in Wheeling were the legitimate government of Virginia, not the secessionists in Richmond. So I mean, it's sort of he's a clever lawyer. So I mean, I think that was the basis of his argument.
Oh, I think what he did was a good thing. I think it's hard to argue that the government in Wheeling was the real government of Virginia.
But still, not strict. I mean, it actually is hard to make it, if it's even possible, that was constitutional, right? I mean, Mike, were you saying that that's stretching the Constitution to do that, right? I mean,
it's stretching the Constitution to respond to something patently unconstitutional. I mean, to respond to Virginia's design. I mean, he's doing something that is technically unconstitutional in response to. This is a constitutional nuclear attack, to use your earlier metaphor that Virginia has undertaken. So he'll bring those counties back in under whatever theory he can invent. And I agree with it. It was the right thing to do.
I just want to clear up. Dana Burnett, who just got her degree at Ashland, wrote a fabulous thesis. She's from West Virginia, and she wrote on that whole thing. This is a publishable piece. I put it in for the prize there. I hope she wins it. But it's something both you guys ought to read. It's a spectacular discussion of the whole process by which West Virginia became a state.
That's great. Well, I look forward to reading it. I haven't read it yet, but I'm sure I will. So that's great. Well, gentlemen, thanks so much. I've kept you over a few minutes, but this has really been a fascinating and enlightening conversation. I've enjoyed every minute of it and learned quite a bit. So thanks to both of you again for your time and thoughts this morning.
Same here. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Mac.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. And thanks to everybody who joined us this morning and submitted some great questions. I'll remind you once again that you're going to be asked to fill out a survey form. Please do complete that form, include your address, and we'll send you a letter documenting your participation today. As always, I encourage you to look into an online graduate course offered through the Ashbrook Center. If you enjoy these kinds of conversations, this is how we tend to do things in our classes. You can find out more information about those online courses by looking at our teachingamericanhistory.org page. Also remind you that our next Saturday webinar will be December 13th, same time, 11 a.m. Eastern Time. And our controversial question will be, did Lincoln violate the Constitution? You guys might want to come back for that one, actually. A lot of people I might watch that. Jump in on that one. But we'll be the panelists will be Dr. Eric Sands of Berry College and Dr. Jonathan White of Christopher Newport University. So look forward to seeing you all back at that point. Okay. Until then, best wishes.
Thanks.
Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone.